Hello and happy September. I really hope everyone is well today. If you're in Hudson, New York, it's a little bit drizzly, but we have the sun in our hearts, I'm sure. Speaking of sun, this is the Hudson Eye, and it's the second edition of this incredible festival. I'd like to introduce myself and then really kick off with Erin Levi Garvey, who's the curator of this annual initiative. My name is Jonah Beaucaire. I was born in New York State, close by, to Tunisian and American parents. I'm an artist, and after about 14, 15 years of local cultural activity in town, we are so honored to receive an annual anonymous granted gift, which stimulates local place-based economic activity in town. Really, our tagline is local artists and local venues, as well as local organizations. This is a humanities series crafted by Erin Levi Garvey, and it's called The Hot Topics. It's issues of local concern as well as much larger national and international implication as well. I'm really here to say thank you and to extend the warmest of welcomes. We're here at Hudson Hall, and we're broadcasting via Zoom Webinar Pro. Over to Erin, but I just wanted to thank the anonymous local match. Contact us if you're interested to know more. The J.M. Kaplan Fund and the Fund for Columbia County, the Hudson Tourism Board and the Common Council, and of course Hudson Hall for anchoring the series and our board of directors. We're thrilled to welcome these panelists today who I consider colleagues, and I really would like to say thank you for joining us. Please stay safe. This is Erin Levi Garvey, who co-founded and who also curates the Hudson Eye. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah. Echoing Jonah's sentiment, the Hot Topics series is a daily panel series and lecture series, which we like to say is thinking globally and working locally. Much of the topics that we discuss each day and that we broadcast are global issues, but affect us on many levels. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Vishakha Desai and Melissa Messina, who go back to the days of Art Table and have been colleagues for a number of years. I'll give a brief introduction for each, and then I'll volley over to Melissa to moderate. Dr. Vishakha Desai is the Senior Advisor for Global Affairs for the President of Columbia University, the Senior Research Scholar for Global Studies in its School of International and Public Affairs, and the incoming chair for the Committee of Global Thought. From 1990 to 2012, Dr. Desai held a variety of positions at the Asia Society, initially as the director of the Asia Society Museum, and for the last 8 years as president and CEO. Under her leadership as president of the Asia Society, she expanded the Society's reach in Asia through innovative programs and through the establishment of new centers in the region. In addition to several publications, Dr. Desai is also a frequent contributor to newspapers and magazines both in the US and Asia, and her forthcoming memoir, World as Family, the story of a multi-rooted belonging, will be published by Columbia University Press in early 2021. Curator, friend, and colleague Melissa Messina is a nationally recognized arts professional who has developed thought-provoking exhibitions, dynamic site-specific and responsive projects, and engaging in many educational public programming, both independently and within her leadership in positions at museums and nonprofits around the world. In 2017, she co-created Magnetic Fields, expanding African American diaspora abstraction in the 1960s to today, and intergenerational exhibition spotlighting 21 Black female abstract practitioners. And also in 2017, she served as the first artistic director of Flux Projects in Atlanta, Georgia. She's the co-curator of the 2018 and 2020 Bermuda Biennials. And in addition to serving, select public and private clients, she's a curator of the Mildred Thompson Estate. And over to you, Melissa. Thank you.
Erin, thank you so much for inviting me to interview such an esteemed curator, museum professional, colleague, someone who whose work I've admired for so many years. It's wonderful to connect with you, Vishakha, after it's actually been 12 years since I think we've seen each other. I worked at Art Table, as Erin mentioned, as the National Program Director, and it was an honor to get to honor you with the Distinguished Service Award, and you have gone on to do so many distinguished things since then. In leadership roles in museums, cultural institutions, educational initiatives, corporate environments, the list goes on. So your experiences and perspective is so critical and vital right now. And we get the chance to talk with you when you have a memoir that should be published this spring. So another incredible kind of opportunity to hear your perspective. So thank you to the Hudson Eye for having us, particularly under these very challenging circumstances around a global pandemic. So I'm going to dive right in because I know our time is limited, and I want to really get as many of your thoughts and ideas across as possible. In your memoir, The World as Family, a story of multi-rooted belonging, I was really struck by how often you were reflecting on a younger generation of students that you had worked with. Since we are having such an expansive conversation about the global and local, which you so poignantly state is not antithetical ideas. I thought it'd be interesting to start with a little bit of your personal story and the ways in which maybe your reflections on your early days as an exchange student or early in your career have been, you know, how you've been thinking about that in relation to this younger generation who you seem to respond to and interact with so often.
Well, first of all, thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Jonah, for inviting me to have this conversation. And when I was asked first to do a lecture, I said, no. It'd be much better to have a conversation. And then they suggested you, Melissa, and I'm just so delighted that we can have this conversation. And let me just say a word about this idea of world as family. It actually comes from an ancient Sanskrit phrase, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, written perhaps around 2000 before Christ. So the idea that those of us, and they say the magnanimous ones, should think about the world as family. It's only the limited ones that think about the family as only blood relatives. Mm-hmm. And I take that inspiration from that idea because in this day and age of COVID, if anything, we recognize that the world lives in our body. It's called the pandemic. It's called COVID-19. And we have to deal with this in a personal, local, national, and global level. When you ask me about young people, since I've been at Columbia, but I've always considered myself a teacher. I started my museum career as a teacher, working with 5th grade East Cleveland Public School African-American kids. And I really feel that what young people do is that they give you voice and vision that we often forget that we have. And so when I first came here as an exchange student to America from India, it was a long time ago. It was in the late 60s and I was 17 years old. At a time, as we now know from Kamala Harris's mother's story, that this is in fact right around the time when immigration was changing, but there were hardly any Indians. Most people thought I was Mexican or Spanish or something like that. And I really had never flown before. It's the first time I was on a plane. And then I stayed with an American family and it changed how I look at the world. Here I was in a secondary city in India. Yes, my parents were big freedom fighters. They were amazingly open, but they never had any access to go beyond India, except as my father said, the British jail was the best education he got because he could read about the world right in that jail. And then when I look at the young students today, communication is at their fingertips. When I had to make one phone call from Santa Barbara to India because I had a ski accident and I broke my ankle, we had to wait 3 days to register the call and you could only talk for 3 minutes. A, it was expensive. B, it was impossible. So when young people hear that, they said, what kind of world is that? And they recognize that they are global natives. They know that they connect with the world while they're in a local place. So I often call them that they are not only digital natives, they're global natives. They live in the local, national, and global at the same time. They fight for climate crisis much more than many other people would have imagined because they live that. And so for me, what is different is that I added layers to my life. It's more like a palimpsest, where you add a layer, but the bottom doesn't fall out. It also is different from an immigrant story. You come from a place and become something. I really am trying to say in the 21st century, multiplicity is part of our life. And these young people, they actually live it. But they also feel concerned because there's so much anti-global rhetoric all around us. And it's almost as if global is in opposition to national or local. And it's partly because we have lacked this kind of a Davos man mentality to take charge of what is global. And what I'm trying to say in my book, but also what we do at Columbia in the Committee on Global Thought, is to say global is relational. We have to recognize that we have to think about the action we do are connected to the universe. And it brings me back to the Vedic phrase where they recognize that as a human being, our role to the universe is relational. We are part of much larger world and we have to take responsibility for it. And that is the message of the book. And that's why I think young kids are my Sherpas. The students have actually taught me as much as I could hopefully share some of my thoughts with them.
And that makes me think of, there was a beautiful passage at the end of the book that seemed to encapsulate that ethos, and I wanted to see if I could get you to elaborate on it. It struck me. You say, we may not have all the tools to create an effective working of a global family, but we need to surrender the dream of survival of the fittest and create a vision for sustainability for all. It's interesting to think of that quote after you just said how sort of intuitively the younger generation sort of feels this, but I wanted to, there was something about that quote that really struck me.
Well, thank you for picking that up, actually, because one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that we focus so much sometimes on the self, independence of the self. And what we now are living in is to recognize that interdependence is as important as independence. And so we have to really look at not survival of the fittest, which is like, how can I get ahead by myself? How can I get more what I need? Guess what? You're not going to be able to take any of that when you meet your reward. You're going to have to leave it behind. So we better figure out that it is less about how much can I get to how much we can do it together to survive. And partly, I mean, as you pointed out correctly, that at the end of the book, I'd finished the book pretty much. And then COVID happened. So I said, oh my God, this is a perfect metaphor for my book. So then I did the postscript. And at that point, I began to think about the fact that many traditional non-European culture, but even in some European cultures, there is actually the sense of communal belonging. We have, in a way, gotten away from that. And we have to bring it back to recognize, and that communal belonging is not just about our town, our home, our nation. That community is the global community, because I do feel that the world we're living in today, between pandemics, climate crisis, and communication, that things go like wildfire, creates both fissures and possibilities. And we have to embrace that. It is no longer a kind of good, airy-fairy, idealistic idea. This is the necessity for the survival of our planet. And we better get on with it. You know, we feel it now. Often when people talked about climate, they said, 2 centimeters rise in the ocean. It seems too long ago, look too far away in the future. This reminds us that it is real. And we have to get these tools. The first thing to get in your toolkit is to recognize is global, is relational. It is not like you have to have an option, which some of our politicians, I will not name names, but will say that somehow global is anti-local. The truth is, the minute you go down that route, or local is the only thing you can think about, you are not going to have the toolkits to deal with the simultaneity of these relations. I'm not saying it's all the same, but you have to understand these implications. So in the book, I argue for messiness rather than clarity. I ask for clarity about relationships, but not singularity. And I go against binaries over multiplicity.
And it's interesting, as you say, how this pandemic has really shone a light into all of those fissures that you're talking about, right? It really is affecting all of these elements in a way that is too strong to ignore at this point. And I also find it interesting that, is it possible that this isolation, whether it's a true physical isolation or this feeling of isolation, is also giving us the perspective of the global, right? Is sort of giving us this broader understanding of what that means. I know you described that a little bit in the book as well.
Well, I mean, think about it right now. Here we are isolated in our own home, and here we are connecting. Because of the work I do, I have been in Zoom calls with 200 people from 90 countries. And we are talking more with each other. Young people are hungry for this. And so one of the things we find out is that yes, we're isolated, but we're also connected. It is not but and. And that is actually something we have to recognize, that we don't have a choice to just do one thing and to claim our little plot of land as belonging only to us. We don't have that choice. We have to think, and at the same time, at each layer, you may have different actions. So COVID teaches us that personally, all we can do is to make sure social distancing and wear a mask. That mask is not just to protect us, but it is also to protect others from us. That is our social compact. State-wise, Governor Cuomo points out that then you have to coordinate at the state level how we're going to open, what we're going to do. At the national level, we need a national strategy. Otherwise, people are going back and forth and it doesn't work. Okay, then we have to recognize that ultimately this particular virus that started in China, by the time it came to New York, it came via Italy and it had a different mutation. Globally, what we're seeing is the complete lack of coordination because of the lack of leadership. So you need that at every level, even if it's different. All of it is on the basis of a principle that we are interconnected, interdependent. We need to think about the whole and the part at the same time.
You know, it's interesting, you know, we're speaking in an arts platform as well. You have,
Right.
Speaking of interconnectedness and layers of experience and sort of bringing these different, you know, sort of relational efforts together. You've really done this throughout your career in every aspect of what you've done. And it's really interesting to me to think about you as a young educator, curator, museum director in the 90s, thinking about championing this idea of the local, the national, the global in context of contemporary art, which I think we now sort of take for granted, but was a really radical idea for how to present art in the 90s. So I'm curious, just shifting these broader ideas and focusing them a little bit on arts, you know, what sort of helped you determine that framing, and did you get, you know, what adversity and successes did you experience at that time?
Well, let me start by saying that I was trained as a classical Indian dancer. And so my first response, and my father was a collector and a social activist. So I thought of social activism, political engagement, and arts all kind of related. And when I first came as a high school student and then came back again as a young 21-year-old, and I was at the Cleveland Museum, and I just by accident, I get this job at the Cleveland Museum. This is long before diversity discussions or anything, 1970. And Sherman Lee was the director. Most people think of him as only an aesthete, but he was deeply committed to education. And I was a political science major. I didn't know art history, but the head of education really believed that if you're going to have collections that represent different cultures, we must have teachers who can talk to those cultures in a deep way. He saw me dance and talk about dance, and he said, oh, come talk to me. And then, entirely by happenstance, I get a job at the Cleveland Museum at the age of 21, and I start working with this East Cleveland public school kids. And it was a special program, 6 weeks, 1 day a week, full day, they were with me. And I decided to use dance, visual arts, and to kind of introduce them to Asia, Asian art, especially Indian dance. When they first arrived, they didn't even know where India was. I actually said, do you know where I'm from? And they said, no idea. I mean, I particularly wore Indian dress, you know, thinking, and then I said, oh, I'm Indian. They said, what kind of Indian? Hopi or Navajo? And then we got into this conversation and we get going. So the point of it is that I really realized that the power of art to connect cultures, connect people was powerful. So that art has this capacity to be specific of a place, from a place, and a specific point in time. So this 11th century dancing Shiva sculpture that kids became to see as their friend. And that gave me the passion to say, I can work in a museum, because I was a political science major. I was thinking of IR. I was going to go into the cultural sector that way. And I said, this is a great platform. Then I became an art historian. Then I got my doctorate. And then, so I have always been interested in this idea of connecting and specificity. And specificity creates problem, right? Because there's particular kind of specificity that says, at this point in time, this was created. Then at this point in time, it was taken. At this point in time, somebody else is seeing it. So there is the life of an object that comes through. And so when I came to Asia Society in 1990, my training was at Boston Museum. I had a PhD. I was doing traditional art. But I had begun to feel uncomfortable with the fact that Asian art as an authentic art was only seen from the perspective of the past. So I said, why the hell is this? This doesn't make sense to me. And at that point, there were very, very few things that were done in contemporary art. So when Asia Society approached me, because I hadn't approached them, and offered me the job, I said, you need to know. I think you need to do contemporary stuff, because you're doing contemporary policy, you're doing contemporary issues. Are you willing to tell your Asian friends that there's no contemporary culture? And I said, you may not like it, but that's not the issue. The issue is, do you have the moral argument to say you're not going to see it? That was my argument. And that's how we began. And we started with Asian American Show. And I'm proud of the fact that number of dealers who then have said to me later that usually commercial establishment takes the lead in finding some new things they thought. In this case, we were leagues ahead of contemporary commercial establishments. And then, I mean, there is to say there are lots of other people who were involved later on. But the point being is that it comes from this idea that arts can actually embody multiplicity in them. And that goes back to why I think art is a perfect metaphor for the kind of local, global, national that I'm talking about. Not easy. And we know this right now from the kind of contested monument histories that we're talking about, who deals with what gets destroyed, because these things embody multiple times and multiple contexts. And it makes for, I feel, a perfect metaphor for living responsibly as a global citizen or a global being.
And so it's interesting, have you taken those perspectives into your other professional experiences? Are you using that metaphor and applying it to other initiatives and efforts?
Absolutely, because right now, actually, I'm involved in a big research project, and the seminar I teach for Global Thought, a graduate seminar, is on intersection of politics and culture. And I'm doing politics of visual arts as a big research topic. And we're doing a big program in October on public monuments and contested histories in a global context, not just American context. Because one of the other things that I always feel, I claim both India and America as my country. And I refuse to let people peg me only one way or the other. At the same time, with that duality and multiplicity, I think it makes it possible to open up to the world. And therefore, I sometimes find that in America, we have a sense that what we think is the way the world is. And we don't always listen to where the world is and what they have to say. So in the art world, for the longest time, I used to tell my friends that, you know, if you're using kaleidoscope, but you only see it through your prism, you got to look at that art and not give it any other agency. So why is it that when an Indian artist looks to Picasso for inspiration, we call it copying? When Van Gogh looked to Japanese print, we say he's inspired by. Think about these words. Why? So I pay attention to how people describe the other. What is the agency in that, and who has the agency? What is the power relationship? So I dissect these in classes, and I bring visual art all the time in the work I do, along with performance and other things.
And are you finding that other, you know, sort of education or even corporate initiatives are more responsive and see your experiences in these cultural realms as value added? I mean, that seems like a new perspective, that the thought of art as this metaphor for change and again, the sort of global, national, local, that maybe that's new in some corporate environments and maybe even some educational environments.
I think that it's still new. But I have to say that it was almost, I want to say 20 years ago, right after I became the president of Asia Society. Incidentally, the first person coming from culture for this multidisciplinary institution. It had never happened before. Yale Business School, through somebody who knew me, asked me to come and talk about art in the business school, to talk about what artists can teach and art can teach globally thinking individual. That's when it occurred to me that artists have always been capacious. They look at things from different places. You know, I remember talking to Martin Puryear, who's a really dear friend, and he looked at Indian Mughal miniature, used that as a kind of inspiration for a whole big installation. And the way he looked at that Mughal miniature when I was a curator in Boston was so profound that it opened my eye. I was a curator. I knew this work. And he opened my eyes to ways of thinking about this. And that is in fact one of the powers of art. But we often are also bounded in our own cocoons. And I've always been kind of in multiple places. There's of course a danger, so that by being part of multiple circles, you might have a danger of belonging nowhere. That's true. But you also have no option to belong to only one place. And that, I think, is what I always say to people. The multiplicity means you can no longer be unitary, and you have to embrace diversity.
Right, right. Do you see any negative repercussions to the ever expanding concept of globalization? I mean, I've read some arguments and thought about homogenization, exploitation of expression. It is, you know, as we're trying to encourage and embrace globalization, are there pitfalls and things we really need to be warned to look out for, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the much of criticism and critique of globalization has come from the economic dimension of globalization. Market capital, what I would call the first phase was Coca-Colization of the world, you know, McDonald'sization of the world. Then the second phase was when people started saying, no, the world is flat, like, you know, the Tom Friedman argument, that other places have things happening in their own place. I think the new dimension has to be that actually global is, let's not think of global only in economic dimension, which is about power structures. And yes, globalization has peaks and valleys. It is not flat. Let's get that straight. But within that, recognize that we have to reclaim global in a way that is relational. And I think that, yes, a lot of critique of globalization comes from us versus them. People's jobs are gone, exploitation, all of that is an economic model. And we so privilege the economic model of the world that we don't include cultural, spiritual, other dimensions that need to be part of a global conversation. Because global doesn't only occur by a Davos man, if you will. Global also occurs when a maid from the Philippines goes to UAE or to America, and they try to live in this transnational world. That too is global. So we need to understand the full dimension. And I think you're right that a lot of the backlash comes because we thought when Trump was elected that it all had to do with all this cosmopolitan global arena where people were going all over the map. They had no roots anywhere. And I'm actually arguing for multi-rooted global belonging, not rootless global belonging, because the rootlessness is going to give you superficiality, whereas multi-rootedness gives you complexity, and you got to deal with it somewhere in your life. And it isn't just people who have experience. All of us need to learn to figure out how to do that. And that, I think, is a flip side of saying it is not just the anti-global and national rhetoric. That's very binary, you know. I'm trying to get away from these binaries for sure. And the political parties will use it, whether it's here or in Europe, you know, the Brexit is part of that example. All of it is because we conflate the economic and the cultural and the social all in one ball and only look at it from an economic privilege. So that's the issue.
Right, and I think it also negates the idea that you can hold both. You can be a local and global world. You can be a global citizen and maintain a local enthusiasm, for lack of a word. I was really struck by one of your references in the book of a dancer who had he was originally from Africa and was practicing his career in
yeah, good friend of mine,
yeah, but that his physical body, I can't remember, I have to look up the quote, but
well, you know, I start the postscript by his quote, which is say that the world lives in my body. And it was in reference to my asking him a question saying, Faustin, you've been this amazing dancer. You've been everywhere. He had been living in Europe for a while, partly because his country, Congo, was in tatters. And then 25 years later, he decides to go back. And he lives in a small town, Kisangani, doesn't even go to Kinshasa. And then I said, why? Why would you do that? Right. And he said, because I need to feel my body, tell my stories, and it is through my stories in my body that I connect to the world. Mm-hmm. And they are the most profound compositions he has done. And that to me was, Faustin was just, it kind of blew my mind because I've been feeling it and he was right there and he thought of it that way,
And it seems like you connected with it because that's also your experience, right? I mean, right. And also, as you said, you're a dancer as well. So you're embodying the world as you're moving through it.
I told him, I said, we're the fellow journey people, we've been on the same path, kindred souls. So very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
And that's such the power of art and expression. When we sort of prepared for this talk, right. I know it was important for you to speak. You wanted to speak about, why art isn't, I mean, we embody it, we live it, we breathe it, we know it. But for our audience who may be curious why it's important, there's so many issues that need to be dealt with in the world right now. What can art teach us at this moment?
I do think that one of the challenges we have is that we have made the art profession rather insular. We talk to each other, we write about the way that others in the know would know, and as a result, we don't think about art in a larger social frame. And what you're seeing today in terms of social justice movement and where the museums are being attacked, where other institutions are being attacked, images are being attacked, it's partly because we have not done a good enough job, I feel, of recognizing art that can live in multiple realities. Art can be transcendent, absolutely. The white cube model of the mid-20th century is there, but we went so far in contextless art that we forget the context in which it gets received and the context in which it gets interpreted and seen. And I think we have to play both of these sides together because that is the power of art. Not just this, not just that, but together. And I think that increasingly, I'm just feeling that we will go maybe too much the other way. But we got to figure out how to keep both of these alive for art's sake and for all of our sakes.
Yeah, I do worry about that a little bit in this sort of world of Zoom and sort of digital connectedness, which is a bit of a placeholder as much as it can be quite expansive. But I worry a little bit about what that does for the argument that one must physically experience the art, have that transcendent experience. And I'm sure artists will adapt and find ways to make transcendent work. And of course, video has done that for years. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's interesting to think what some forms of expression, how it might suffer from a moment where we can't have these really tangible experiences.
But look at what happened. Metropolitan just opened. And they have limited people, and I'm told that there are lines waiting to get in, that people are hungry for real encounter. So my buzzword is and, not but.
Right.
It is not this at the expense of this. It is this and that. And how can we actually do that? Because I do think that Zoom has made many things possible, but it has also made us hungry to see real people, real things, real work. So I think to some extent it acutely reminds us what we miss. And so I'm not too worried about that. And I think that an artist I have a lot of faith in because they're going to figure out in other ways. But it also means that there are a lot more possibilities too, you know, so that's something to think about.
Yeah, you're right. And it's that this isolation that we're all having that's making us really understand what's valuable and important to all of us.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to think about also is at the institution level. What does that really mean? Now, I don't want to minimize that we are in a particular place where the power dynamics of institutions are being called into question, and rightly so. And we have to reflect on what that means, especially in the art world, because, I talk to so many of my colleagues, and I can tell you when I was at as a member of the Association of Art Museum Directors, and I became the president by members who nominated me, and there were barely 2 of us of color. This is not good. You can't, and at the same time, you can't just say, gee, how am I going to find the person at the top? Because if you have not created a pipeline, if you have not created the curatorial side, and some people are doing that work, very rightly so, but it almost has to start early in high school to get kids excited. And then recognize that you have to support them all the way through. If you don't come from a culture where it's part of your life, what is it that's going to make a difference? And yet when you talk to artists like Martin Puryear, as a child, he was going to a museum and he was drawing things all the time. So he was looking at all parts of the world. It opened up the world to him. That is the power of museums. But right now, we can't see it because we only see the economic power structure, not the visual power of art. And how do we deal with it? So representation, power, equity issues are all around us. And to navigate that in a subtle, responsible, but clear way is a real challenge.
And I do hope that, as we were talking, that this moment has shined a light and made the arts feel more important than ever, that I hope that the dollars follow, because what the community is asking to hold museums accountable to do, which they desperately need to do, requires funding.
Right.
And so I'm really hoping that, the calls for these kinds of shifts will also resonate in the philanthropic world and the corporate world to help make this reality.
And Aaron has just asked the question, so I would pick that up on that, is that how can you further democratize art and break the stigmas of elitism in order to have communities engage, appreciate, and understand the arts? One of the things why I told the story about the Cleveland Museum in 1970s is that late 60s, early 70s were one of those moments where civil rights struggles were big, where people were thinking about how to engage the communities. Out of that emerged this kind of East Cleveland Public School project. And Sherman had decided that there were 3 public school teachers on the payroll of the Cleveland Museum. This is 1970, mind you. And so that, in fact, we know how to do some of this. Right. Now, the difference between then and now is at that point, it was a little bit of a noblesse oblige, right? We have these wonderful things, we got to make it available to you, rather than recognizing that there's still the power structure that also has to be changed. In the 1990s, with the diversity dialogue and things that are opening up, again, was that moment. So there have been moments before. What it seems to me is different now is the demand for systemic change that is not just on top of. And systemic changes are the hardest to crack. But at the same time, all I know from my personal experience is at the Asian Society, we work with Surya in the school, and we had these kids working with us from Bronx, Brooklyn, Harlem, Queens, and the kids engaged with the artists in classroom, brought them in and their classroom teachers, and we would show their work at the Asian Society, and we would invite their parents. what had happened was because kids had come in, they were familiar with the place. And then they actually became the teachers for their parents. But we need to really, it can't be fashion of the day. It has to be consistent. And then you have to recognize that people do like to see who look like them in positions of power. It's important. You know, I didn't quite recognize until when I first became the director of the museum, and Holland Cotter had done a piece in the New York Times. Letters I got from Asian Americans, young kids and others saying, gee, we never thought that a Manhattan institution, Rockefeller institution would have something like this. It made me feel good that somebody looks like me. This is important. And we have to recognize that it requires work too, because normally what happens? People go to people they know. And they don't know a whole lot of people, then they don't go. But there's also the whole issue of pipeline, issue of training, and issue of having support, financial support, that actually makes that possible. So it has to be a multi-pronged effort. It can't be, and that is what I think is needed now. And that multi-pronged effort means trustees, senior position, training, audience, programming, and all of that has to come together. It is not outreach. This is in-reach. And that's what has to happen. Yeah.
In reach, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're nearing the 2 o'clock hour and we do have a hard stop. Are there other questions that have come in while I've been so engaged in talking to you? I don't know if anything.
Follow-up question, and that is that art can teach in the global context for other industries for seeing, hearing, and learning differently. Do you see this as a model that will be employed further going forward into other industries? And if so, what industries do you think is in the most need of seeing these lessons? This, you know, there are very few examples, but examples work. I know that Davos has this, World Economic Forum has a young leaders program, global leaders program. And then School of the Arts at Columbia, under the leadership of Carol Becker, actually developed a program that was to use drama to actually get people to think about themselves in a public setting and what that would be. And it's been highly, highly successful. But what happens is that we have to create tools that connect directly. And we don't have enough people on either side to bring those two together. So for me, when I went to Yale, it was because it was the head of one of the largest PR agencies who was a Yalie, was on their board of the business school. And he invited me because he wanted them to talk about and think about visuality in a different way. So it requires people coming together. We have not really, and also there is sometimes an allergy, if you will, for some people in the arts to say, don't instrumentalize the art. Art is not to serve other functions. Art should be pure. It is what it is. It is different from everything else. And my feeling is that I think you have to think about the aesthetic power of art and its place in the society and do it in that sense. But it's not like it's an illustration of something. It's more about a catalytic force of art that we have to figure out. And that is not an easy thing to do. So the question is that lots of industries, especially those that want to be in the global arena, need to think about art in a different way. But we also in the art world have to figure out how to make that connection work.
Right, right. There's a reciprocity there that's both sides responsible.
Right, right. So Melissa, what are you doing now? I want to ask you.
Oh, you're so sweet. I am actually taking this time to incubate a few different ideas on how to think about providing artist services and, you know, estate planning services to artists whose market maybe hasn't really allowed them to have the type of planning power that the Mitchells and Rauschenbergs and Warhols allow. So working with some leaders in the field as a bit of a think tank to try to tease out some of these ideas, to try to create models that make these types of artist services more affordable. It's amazing how many artists who have been marginalized out of the market because of race, gender, maybe even the type of art that they make. It's a
age.
Yeah,
absolutely.
age, absolutely. But there's an incredible number of artists who are needing to think about how to plan for their estates and just simply don't have the funds to do it, and have fantastic legacies that need to be upheld and archived, and we might, you know, stand to lose that history. So that's what I've been spending my time thinking about the past 6 months.
Good work, good work. And that Jonah says there's a question.
Okay.
So let's see what that is. Jonah?
Sure, absolutely. And the incredible technical team of the Hudson Eye is free to release the video. We have this sort of street line of lower Hudson Street, which is actually predominantly, to be specific, there's a large Bengali community that's there, and just unbelievable diversity of all kinds, types, and sizes in this town. I wanted to share with Vishakha and also to share with Melissa that Aaron, as curator, actually in planning this edition, the research trip was to the Lahore Biennial. And a part of that was the mapping, as well as the historic sites, as well as the spectacular use of food, which sort of iterates throughout some of the Hot Topic series. And it was curated by Hur Al-Qasimi, who is Emirati. What I think Vishakha points us to, and I am thankful beyond words that she has, is that we know and celebrate and appreciate this intersectionality, but if there is a notion, a loose notion of the global South, curatorially, and we have an Emirati curatorial voice in that part of the world, I guess one question I would have is how do we iterate? How do we iterate? So if it's a Biennale structure, that's every 2 years. If the Hudson Eye programs along this very street every year, I guess I just want to share that the planning happened, and then to share with Vishakha, with whom we agree and celebrate, how can we do better? Be it annually with the Hudson Eye, during the pandemic, or getting these biennials to change?
Well, I do think that, you know, there is a fair, you are obviously doing a lot of work, but I do think that one thing is consistency, and that everything you do, are there different voices? Are there voices that otherwise are marginalized? Are there voices that have something to say, that there is a place for it? Not token, not individual. If you have a planning committee, who is in the planning committee? If you have the great Bengali community, and maybe they're not artists per se, but what is their sense of visual practice, and where does that come from? And I know, for example, in especially in Bangladesh, there's amazing. There's a great, by the way, a Dhaka Biennial. That's very strong, very good. But the most important thing is also, so maybe you can bring somebody from Dhaka, where these people, your colleagues, your communities, people would really feel like their voice is heard, that somehow there's something that they can also look up to. So, but I do think that that requires constant vigilance and consistency of effort. You know, I remember a long time ago when I was working on the contemporary shows, and I talked to a fairly prominent curator, I will not name names or the institution. And when we started talking, and he said, but how could there be any good art in Asia? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if it was any good, I would have seen it. I said, well, when was the last time you went there? And he said, but after all, New York is the center of the world art, and I would have seen it in New York. And I said, right there is your problem. You think that New York is the world. Actually, guess what? It isn't. And that was a long time ago. I mean, lots of things have changed. But the point is that we have to constantly be reflective, question our assumptions, and make sure that what we talk about and what we do have consistency.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that unbelievable reply that synthesizes it. Vishakha also has a hard stop at 2, and it is our honor to have her. I would also like to point as well to the many people on this call. There is a resilient program that I look to as a touchstone called Building Bridges. And Saiba Rahman as well, who's really taking a look at a lot of those intersections. But we have Aaron kind of running the show here and making a bridge.
Take it away, Aaron. Thank you for allowing us to have this little free-range conversation.
May I also chime in for a quick second to second on Jonah's question too, that I think to the point Vishakha made earlier about needing to be more diversity within the curatorial practice, within educational systems, within boardrooms, etc. I think that also all begins with mentorship and Vishakha's incredible career of having brought people along with her that she saw the potential in, gave them experiences. And I think, of course, Aaron is a brilliant curator doing a fantastic job with the Hudson Eye to bring a young curator along to mentor and have, you know, so few people get to have that experience, you know, that it really, I think, and we see that in a crisis of leadership in our political system too, right? If we're not bringing this younger generation with us and that represents diversity, it never gets anywhere. We tend to stay the same.
Right. I couldn't agree more. I think being there for younger, ambitious curators, historians, writers, a rising tide, you know, raises all ships kind of thing. And I wouldn't be where I am today without my mentors, and I'm forever thankful of that. So thank you both for this conversation. It's been quite incredible and insightful and everything that I hoped it was going to be.
And Bianca's question, we have our little countdown. That's Aaron's
We do
cue.
have one. We have
Bianca
3
Golden,
minutes.
activist and education major.
How do we push the boundaries where more people from different racial, economic, and academic backgrounds can be part of these types of dialogues? Where can we challenge the elite/hierarchy of these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, I would just simply say consistency, regularity, and constantly pushing for that so that it is actually front and center, not a secondary thought.
Yep. Wonderful. Melissa, your thoughts?
I second it. I think, you know, having Vishakha here to have this conversation and be an example to all of us. Thank you for your years of leadership, your dynamic, forward thinking. We are all very indebted to you for catching us up to your vision and to share your book. That's the question. When can we get the book?
The book, it should be February, March 21. It's going into production. It'll have some art in it as well. So it should be fun. But thank you again, really. It's
Vishakha, Melissa, thank you.
So it's great.
It's wonderful to see you both too. Thank you so much. And everyone that attended.
To Hudson in person.
Please do.
The Bengali food and everything else that you have.
Yes.
So thank you.
Incredible.
Our guest
Everyone
of honor.
that's attended, thank you so much. This has been another iteration of our Hot Topics series. We'll see you tomorrow, same Zoom channel, as we discuss the indigenous histories of the Hudson Valley. This evening, we have a performance with Natalie Jonas, and we'll see you at Rick's Point. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you and best.